What's up, everyone? It's Joe. I am with Chris from Audioscape. Thanks for being with us today. Thanks for hosting us.
Thanks for coming by.
All right. Well, so what I have requested is a little rundown on some of their products because they have a pretty vast product line. Some of this stuff is recreations of things that are 50 years old, you know, and so there's a lot of misinformation out there about what's going on inside these and how they use them, for example. So give us I know you could probably go full on nerd, right, and just go scientific. But for people like me that isn't all that bright, maybe give us 20% layman's term nerd talk about what's going on in here.
Okay. Well, here we have the EQP, the EQP-A that we released. We actually released this after the MEQ-A, which.
So this was your first product.
Yeah, this is the first. Line. Yeah, the first product in this line, and maybe it's because I come from a guitar background. I just was really into the mid-range EQ. So I think what's interesting though is this was released in the early 50s. It was the first product that Pulse had back then, and it's now 2024. It's been 70 plus
years.
This is still relevant, right?
Yeah.
And I think one thing we were talking about earlier that's important to note is these are not precision equalizers. This is not a Soundtech mastering equalizer. This is not, so you don't think in terms like you were talking about earlier with turning 60 and that's what I'm affecting,
right.
with the shelving aspects of the low frequency. So as far as differences, I'll just give you a quick rundown of that. What makes this special? Obviously, it's a passive EQ. Both of these are passive EQs. So if you just imagine what you see on the front panel here has no power running through it. You can just turn the thing on, put your hands in there, touch all around. Nothing's going to happen. I wish you could say that about most of the gear we make, but you can't.
You probably have scars on your fingertips to prove otherwise. Right?
Yeah, or internal damage, probably. Yes. So yeah, it's all passive. So these are passive equalizer circuits. There's, documentation that this was licensed from the EQP-1 was licensed from Western Electric, they say. And then what made it special though is the line amps as well. So when you think, especially, I know they made some solid state versions, but when you think about the tube Pultecs, you think about those line amps. And I think it's an important way, without getting too nerdy, it's an important way to look at a device like this. It's in circuit blocks or just sections, not even say circuit blocks, but just sections. So you got your passive EQ and then you have your line amplifier, and each is doing its own thing to create that sound. So when you think of it as a tone box, obviously it's the EQ has its own tone, but really those tubes, those transformers in the line amp. And what I think is really cool about both of these is the line amps are extremely different. So the line amp in this push-pull uses 3 tubes.
We're talking about the EQP-A.
Yes. EQP-A has a push-pull line amp. It uses an interstage transformer as well, which is extremely crucial to the tone and bandwidth of the device. I learned that the hard way. That took a couple years. But yeah, the interstage transformer is extremely important. But yeah, it uses the input tube of a 12AX7. The output tube is a 12AU7. And sometimes people stop there with just those 2 tubes when they do that. But I think it's extremely important that you use the rectifier tube like the original design did as well. It uses a 6X4 rectifier tube. And that's a part of the tone of that line amp. So that's something that's extremely important to have.
And that varies from our mid friend here.
Yep.
In what way? The MEQ-A.
The MEQ-A, it actually has a single-ended line amp. It's actually really, that's a lovely line amp as well. And that uses, it does use a 12AX7 as the input tube, but it uses a 6AQ5 as the output tube. And it uses the same 6X4 rectifier as well that this uses. And it's a completely different sound. If you turn both these off and you listen, they sound different. And that is a part of the sound of this. And it's not something to just
don't gloss over that.
Yeah, you don't gloss over that for sure. It's extremely, if I was just choosing line amps, I'd probably just choose, obviously, the line amp of the MEQ, just sonically. I really, really love it. But at the same time, there's obviously options on this.
Right.
From the passive EQ side that make it maybe more flexible to some people, and maybe this is why it's more popular. Obviously, you can do
I have a stereo pair of these for my stereo bus from you. I have your recreation of it, and I think one thing we should talk about, because maybe it's misunderstood sometimes, is the fact that you can boost and cut at the same time. Some people say, yeah, everyone knows that.
Everyone knows that.
No, they don't. Not everyone knows that. So whether you use this as hardware, or some of our friends have a plug-in version or something, they need to know about this trick. And maybe you can tell us, dispel the myths, tell us the facts about it.
Well, first of all, the original manual, like, dissuaded you from doing that. They were like,
that's awesome. Yeah. Because that's exactly what we do. We're rule breakers, aren't we? Yeah.
Well, and it's so funny because by today's standards, I think just a design like this breaks so many rules, but they were telling you not to do that because, it's a shelving, equalizer in the low end, especially so. But there's something special that happens, especially at 30 here. Mm-hmm. And once you start boosting and cutting at the same time, it's not just affecting 30. Like, right. you got to get that out of your brain. It's actually, it's starting to boost up a little bit of 80 and it's starting to cut a little bit of 200. And that's really what creates that pleasing effect. And that's like, I call it like take the blanket off the speakers effect. Mm. It really does something that's just like magic, where if you have them, like a pair like you have on your mix bus, and you turn that on, if you go between bypass and that, it's just like, wow. Yeah. Like sometimes you'll think like, oh, mix sounds good, whatever. And then you do that. And you're like, where were you all my life? Yeah. Like it's that kind of
and people
life changing.
Some of our friends put these, if you have them, on tracking days on a kick drum or a snare drum. Cause they're fantastic sounding, but yeah. So the trick is you boost and then you cut as well, but you cut less than you boost. And so you end up with more bottom end than you had. So you're getting your bottom end heft, but because the filters are different shapes, it affects frequencies differently. And the next thing you know, you have more bottom end, but the thing about it, you don't have more bottom end just for the sake of more bottom end. You don't just have mud. It's more, but it's still clean. And I don't know.
It's like you described, you're starting to boost some low end. You're getting more low end presence and you're cutting mud at the same time. And one thing, even like we notice it on a lot of our tube devices, there's something like that's really special that they do, like with this beefy low end, where it doesn't get muddy. And that's what I love about a lot of tube devices. They sort of add so much weight, but they don't get in the way, if that makes sense.
Now, the boost and the cut here, for those that maybe haven't played with one of these devices, the boost is on this knob. Yes. The cut is not affected. The cut frequencies are right here. So it's not uncommon for me on some songs to take 10 or 12K and boost just a little bit for some presence and some air, but at the same time, cut a little 20 if I'm trying to create, let's say, a blues song or a jazz song, a Broadway show or something like that, where you don't want it to get too glossy. You're not looking for the top 40 pop thing. So you can get a little presence somewhere in here, but you can also make sure it doesn't get out of control. Yeah. I really love the attenuation on the top of this
I'm
thing.
glad you mentioned that. That's like one of my favorite things, especially, cutting a little bit of 20. You're going to, like, in today's digital harshness world, it's like,
it's a thing, man.
It really is a thing.
And the bandwidth knob.
Yes. That's really, I think
misunderstood by some guys.
Yeah. And it's obviously very cool. You can get that kind of parametric thing here with the sharp and the broad. I mean, I think.
But it's only affecting that. Yeah. It's only affecting the top. This is not affecting the bottom, correct?
Yeah. You could literally line it out. If this is probably modern design, they'd probably just add lines here.
Right. Exactly.
For like, but we had to figure it out. It just took us 70 years, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So, we're going to have some examples in just a minute, but let's talk about this guy a little bit. So we have a peak on the bottom, 2, 3, 5, 700, and 1,000 cycles right here. We have the mid dip, a lot of the same frequency selections on the low end, 2, 3, 5, and 7. But then we start going way above that. 1, 1, 5, 2, 3,000 cycles, 4,000 cycles, 5,000 cycles, 7K, we can cut.
And I think this is when people think of this device, this is what they think about. They think about the mid dip, what it does, how it does. It's like a complex contour tool. And this is a big part of that. It's right smack here in the middle. You're going to get, it's just, you can just quickly cut out anything that's muddy or offensive with this. And it's a wide range of frequencies.
But then we can add some presence up here as well.
Yes. And what's interesting about the peak section in this, and I feel like sometimes people get underwhelmed with the high boost on this because it's set to broad, right?
Mm-hmm,
so like there's no bandwidth control here. It's fixed at broad, but
true to the original though.
Yeah. And that's what it is, but it's still doing something that's obviously very pleasing. And I feel like sometimes people, they expect more out of the high boost, but it's overall, it's a more subtle tool, but you can get possibly, depending on the source material, even better results with this versus this. It's just like, it just depends on the source. They are equally useful.
From an insider perspective that talks to a lot of professional engineers, this is the one that gets all the attention. I mean, for a great reason.
Yeah.
It's the stereo bus,
It's got a little bit more wow factor.
Yeah, it does.
Bigger is better,
But what a lot of pros talk about, that's not on all the blogs and it's not on all the fancy YouTube videos is this guy. So it's like one of those, like, if you know kind of thing. Yeah. Snare drums. So many things. It's just useful.
Anything that lives in that mid range, and that's a
Which
lot
is everything.
of horns, vocals, snare. Like it's all across the map. So most program material can benefit from going through these. And one thing I do want to mention, because I've seen it a little bit lately, is adding. I went into the line amp a little bit as far as why it's special. This thing as a whole is extremely special, but you can't just add a mid cut to an EQP and have the same thing.
Okay.
It's not going to do the same thing. I mean, that might
it's not going to be historically accurate sounding.
Yeah. Or you might not, you'd be surprised. You're going to get better results carving your mid range, with these 3 bands and this line amp of this, as opposed to just chucking that option into this and, and thinking it's the same thing.
Understood.
So, it's.
Well, what if I plug these in and get busy doing some demonstrations for the people?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, man. Thank you so much.
Heck yeah.
All right, guys, what I thought we would do is just take a listen to some of these in action. We can only talk about them so much before you have to hear them. So what I have right now is the classic EQP-A. So this is the low end, top end, the classic tube passive EQ that we all know and love. So let's give it a listen. What I have to start with is a lead vocal, a female lead vocal, and let's see about giving it some nice air. So here it is raw.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
Sounds great, but let's see just how sweet. When we talk about passive EQ, one thing that you can't get away from is the sound of the high frequency boost. They're stunningly beautiful. Let's go up to 12K. Let's try 10K. That may make it a little sibilant, but let's try it. And so I've engaged, and I'm going to turn the boost up, and we're just going to listen to it. Ready? And I'm going to do it broad. See right here, the high frequency boost. Remember, the bandwidth is included right here. So I'm going to turn it halfway up and listen.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
Listen, even the sibilance, yes, we're boosting it because it's in that frequency range, but it's not getting harsh. These are just stunningly beautiful on the top end.
Maybe I could finally be bold.
Now, granted, that's a lot of boost, but just before and after, let's just see. I want it more about being appropriate. I want you to hear just how sweet the high frequency is. So here's no boost.
Maybe I could finally be bold. Maybe I could finally be bold.
That's what these things are capable of. So what I would probably do is I'd probably come up to around 12 and dial it in.
Maybe I could finally be bold.
Bandwidth broad.
If I could just loosen my hold.
And a cool trick with these things is that you can also engage the attenuator. So you can go up to the top. If it starts getting, you want the presence, you want the shine, but you don't want too much. Let's say it was recorded on an inferior microphone, which we encounter, right, a lot, is you can also dial back the very, very top end while boosting what's just below it. So you get your presence, but you don't get some of that real high step that you don't want. Check this out.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
So we're still getting the sound of the tubes, the transformers, before and after. Let's try this.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my.
In.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
That's a cool trick. And you can also, let's say you have a female vocalist that is a little thin, or a guy that wants to sound more impressive in the lower register. Sometimes I get that, request. So I can take the low frequency, go up to 100 cycles. So we're affecting those bottom couple octaves in the audible range of a vocal, and boost it.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
And the cool thing is now, not so much on a vocal, more so on instruments is generally when I find myself doing this trick. But what you can also do is boost it too much and then attenuate it. And because, as we were talking about, the filter shapes are different on the boost and the cut, we come out with something that wouldn't be possible otherwise.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
Okay, let's check that. In and out.
Maybe I could finally be bold. Maybe I could finally be bold.
So we have more air and more body. So that's really cool things that these machines are capable of. All right, so what we're going to try now, we're going to switch over to the MEQ-A, and this is the mid-band tool. So let's engage it. And what we can do with a tool like this, for example, most instruments and most vocals need something removed around anywhere from 200 to 500. That's just a common problem area. A lot of times it's around the 300 cycle range. So I'm not saying it's a problem on this vocal, but it's very typical. So what we would do is something like this.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen.
So a lot of times in a track, as we know, that's where it's building up and competing with the upper end of a bass guitar, the lower couple octaves of an electric guitar, acoustic guitar, piano, synths. All those things are building up in that range. So we end up dipping a lot of things in that area. So that's what we get, that sweet tube transformer, classic passive EQ thing. But we, that we get on this, but we can also get our mid-range detail out of this piece. I've got to add one of these to my collection. I have this in software form only, and I'm getting jealous. And let's add a little 5K, see what it sounds like.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen.
Before and after.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my hold.
Just so sweet. Plus, we can also add the body that we added on the EQP-A. We can also add with the far left side of the MEQ. So, for example, we go down to 200 and we wanted to add a little body to a female vocalist. We can do this.
Maybe I could finally be bold.
Let me just get rid of that 300 cycle cut that I did, just so we hear the 200 cycle boost more predominantly.
Maybe I could finally be bold if I could just loosen my.
That's one of those things that a little could go a long way. So 2 dB of that.
Maybe I could finally be.
That's a really good trick that I use a lot on jazz singers, Broadway style vocals, anything where the band is a little more sparse than the the big modern pop type arrangement, and they want to sound bigger than life. They want to sound full and just very, very in your face. Sound like they're, the words are being spoken right here in front of us. Is I go into a passive tube circuit and add a little bottom end around, anywhere from 180 up to 300. It really depends on the vocal. It can really depend on the gender of the vocal as well. And that's a fun little trick. All right, so I have an acoustic guitar. That's another thing that sometimes we just want a sparkly top end, and sometimes the mic that captured the source just does not have that. And some EQs will introduce unpleasant high end, and sometimes it even brings out what's unpleasant about the microphone. That is just something that we encounter as mix engineers. So one way to counteract that is to go through a passive tube circuit, because there's literally, as he was mentioning, it operates in just a completely different manner. So instead of boosting, we're actually reducing how much attenuation is being done. That's a long story, but let's turn the bandwidth up on the high end, and let's go up to around 12K, and let's start dialing in some boost. All right, so we'll engage. We'll turn the bandwidth up a little bit. I think that'll help you guys hear the sweetness of the circuit. We'll go up to 12K, and we'll boost this guy. I was adding like 7-8 dB of top end right there, and you still hear. Now, I went way past the point of sounding good as far as appropriate. However, did you hear the quality of the high end? That's the thing that these guys can do. Check that out one more time. Everything that's great about the top end is what's being enhanced. I absolutely love it. And now on this one, I wouldn't, typically on an acoustic guitar, we're not adding bottom end. But what we can do is sometimes we can cut some low mids. So that said, let's come over here to the MEQ. Let's go to we're not going to use the peak at all, but let's go to the dip. And let's start around 200, because I'm hearing, that's kind of what I'm hearing. Let's check this out. Now that's too much in solo, but sometimes in a mix, acoustic guitars, we intentionally thin them out quite a bit to make bottom end open up for electric guitars and synths. But that's where this guy can come in handy. So we get that, everything that he was talking great about, the tubes, the transformers, the line amps, we get that sound even though we're dipping through this circuit. So we're still getting a quality of sound just because we're running through this thing. And here's another cool thing on acoustic guitars that I like to do, and it doesn't work on every guitar, but when it's right, it's right. And that's about half the time, is in a dense mix. 4K seems to be a magic frequency for me to get it. I call it the jangle. So sometimes a little bit of 15K, 14K, 12K for some sparkle, but a little 4K can bring this element of making it come forward in the mix in real estate that's, not being taken by some other things. Let's check that out. Hear that jangle? This will be without. Now with the dip and the presence boost. You combine that with a little 12 or 16K from this guy, and it's going to sound stunning. All right, let's check out one other source. All right, now I've got drums pulled up. Okay, so I'll start with the EQP-A. That's a classic drum tool. So you can add a little air around the cymbals, a little snap on the snare drum, but you can also enhance the kick drum and the really low end of the snare drum and the floor toms. So let's check it out. Let's start with let's boost and attenuate at 30 cycles. I know that seems low, but as Chris was saying, the shifts that occur are actually well above that. So that's why you see it. If you ever see guys, experienced guys that you respect, and you see this frequency selected way down at 30, that's why. This is a very broad stroke paintbrush. So let's boost. That is that is impressive sounding low end. Now what I'll do is I'm going to attenuate as well. Before and after. That kick drum is punching us in the chest now. And without the attenuation, check it out. Here's the kick drum with, what is this, 5 dB at 30. Now with 5 dB of attenuation added, they don't cancel each other out. Without, with. In theory, you expect that to cancel out, but it doesn't at all. So that is a great trick for these kind of things. But what we can do, let's leave it at around 4 and 3. So we're definitely, generally I do boost more than I attenuate, but let's turn the bandwidth up on the top end a little bit. And let's add, let's say 10,000 cycles, and let's see what we're getting out of the snare drum backbeat. Let's add some air around that guy. Okay, so I'm going way too much, possibly. I'm wearing headphones, so maybe I'm not hearing everything as perfect as I should. Plus, I have speakers hitting me on open back phones, but that's okay if I make bad decisions and go too far. I make bad decisions. We've all done it, right? Okay, so let's start about halfway up on the boost, and let's go all the way up, because I want you to hear what on some EQs it turns to absolute trash, does not on an EQP-A or any passive design. Isn't that, I mean, how sweet is that? I mean, it's too much, right? But it's sweet. Here's without. Let's go down to about 5. It seemed like a pretty magic number. No processing, but just going through the circuit. Now with. Now, usually I would go up to around 10K on this, but we have no cymbals going, I don't think. So we could even go down by 8K or even 5K, because it's the snare drum and attack of the kick that we're primarily going to get. Now let's go down to the MEQ-A. And let's see what 1K is going to do to the attack of the snare and the kick drum. Let's engage it. Here we go. Okay, now let's take that up to 3K. The kick drum is really liking 3K. Let's go up to 5K and see what it's doing. The snare drum is loving that. Let's go to 4K and hear what it's doing to the kick and snare, both. Okay, very cool. Now let's do one other thing. Let's go to the center section here where the dip is. And let's go to 500 cycles, which, a lot of times that's where there's some just buildup of mush. So let's keep about 4 dB or so of peak boost at 4K, and let's cut some 500. So that's about 4 on the meters or on the silk screen on the cut and the boost. And now let's hear before and after. There's just something about these boxes. To me, the passive circuit is just magic. There's no high end sweeter than that high end, that bottom boost attenuation trick. It does things that other gear cannot do. And basically passive EQs are on, I would say 98% of every mix I do is running through a passive EQ on the stereo bus. And a lot of times there's bits and pieces of them on individual tracks as well. Now, I have 2 of these EQP-As on my stereo bus. As a matter of fact, I do not have the MEQ-A, and I'm gonna have to rectify that. I'll probably have to write a check and leave it on the counter here when I leave. But thanks so much for watching, guys, and stay tuned because we got more videos of this gear coming soon.